I'm curator of public programs. I'm going to set a scene for you. Saturday, December 18th, 2010, morning. I'm at my kitchen table reading the Globe and Mail. That in itself is a miracle because at that time my daughter was 3. I came across a headline and it said, "The United Colors of Melanson." And I read about this wonderkind, as the reporter had mentioned, called him, who was invited to be special advisor on arts and culture to Mayor Rob Ford. And I became captivated by Mr. Melanson's philosophy of cultural enterprise. It is based on 2 bedrock assumptions: entrepreneurship and education/outreach. So the 2 E's. Well, what did I do? I got up and I turned the TV on to keep my kid busy. And then I sat back down and I read the rest of the article. Because as a worker in a cultural institution, these 2 E's are also the bedrock of what we seek to do here in a lifelong learning cultural institution dedicated to art and history, such as Museum London. What's more, as a practicing artist myself, hanging out with other artists, this conversation comes up quite frequently, and we do talk about these issues such as entrepreneurship and education. We might not use those words, but we're talking about these issues. So I ripped the article out and I put it in my growing file of research on people and ideas. And I became determined to get Jeff here somehow, somewhere. I didn't quite know when or how. Well, it's been a few years, and the wonderkind is now president of the Banff Centre. And this is when we really decided we needed to get him here. And how were we able to do that? We were able to bring Jeff here through a newly minted partnership with Western University's upcoming School for the Advanced Studies of Arts and Humanities, on the one hand, as well as the Public Humanities at Western Initiative, on the other hand. Both of these organizations are under the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. So last year, as I began to work with Dr. Joel Faflak, and who's the director of SASA, the School for the Advanced Studies of Arts and Humanities, and Joshua Lambier, who is one of a team of powerhouse individuals running the Public Humanities at Western initiative, it became clear that we had similar interests, even though we might have different kinds of mandates. One interest is entrepreneurship, and the other one is education, the 2 E's. So at that point, a light bulb went off, or maybe on, and we thought this is the ideal moment to bring Jeff Melanson here, to bring the president, reach out to the president and bring him to the museum and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. And both entities became very excited about the possibility of Jeff sharing with us his philosophy of cultural enterprise. Well, that's a little history on it, and I want to really thank Dr. Joel Faflak and Joshua Lambier, these 2 individuals in particular, for their tireless work on this initiative. And I would also like to thank the Faculty of Arts and Humanities for their support with the endeavor as well. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Dr. Faflak, and he is going to speak a little bit more about the new school that will be launching in the fall. We call it SASA, and because it's a longish name, and he is then going to introduce Mr. Melanson for us, so I'll do that.
I'll be as brief as possible. Yes, SASA is a new venture in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. It takes the liberal arts education model and gives it a new twist, which is to add experiential learning and community service to the traditional model of a liberal arts education. And the idea is to get students out in the community and get them thinking about how it is that their cultural education matters in the world out there. And at some level, it's what we've always been doing in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. We just haven't always done the best job of, quote unquote, selling that mission to the public. And we're passionately committed to doing that now because it's simply a reinstatement of what it is that we've always been doing in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. And so it's a wonderful venture to get started. It's a wonderful thing to be a part of. It's wonderful to be able to partner with people like Museum London and with Public Humanities of Western to make this happen. And we had a roundtable discussion this afternoon with Jeff, with various people from the Western community and from the public community here in London, and the excitement and the energy in the room was so palpable. It was really wonderful to see that kind of thing happening now, and I thank all of you who participated in that for your energy and for your presence there. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. I have to confess that up until recently, I did not know who Jeff Melanson was, and that's my ignorance, not anybody else's. And so I went online and I did research into his background, and I went, oh God, he's accomplished, he's bright, he's young. And then I saw a picture of him. I'm not going to embarrass him, I'm going to so embarrass him. I'm like, oh Jesus, he's good looking, he's solid. And then of course I meet him and he's tall. And so I really want to hate him, except that he's really nice. So I hate this guy. Jeff Melanson was appointed president of the Banff Center in 2012. He holds a BA in music from the University of Manitoba, where he studied opera, Russian art song, and choral conducting. Jeff also pursued vocal studies at Oberlin Conservatory, and he has an MBA from Wilfrid Laurier University, formerly my alma mater. He's a member of the Young Presidents Organization and a trustee with the National Guild for Community Arts Education in the United States. Melanson was the first arts leader to be appointed one of Canada's top 40, under 40, for 2009. It gets more sickening as it goes on. Between 2000 and 2006, Jeff held various posts at the Community School of Royal Conservatory of Music, where he was promoted to Dean in 2001, and where he built that program into the largest community arts school in North America. In 2006, Jeff was appointed Executive Director, Co-Chief Director Officer of Canada's National Ballet School. During his time there, he oversaw the elimination of a significant annual operating deficit, increasing annual revenues by over 50%, overseeing the completion of residence renovations, and creating new strategic partnerships with many nonprofit and for-profit arts and entertainment groups. He really was the ideal interlocutor and mediator and participant to have at this afternoon's roundtable. In 2010, Melanson was named Wilfrid Laurier University's MBA Alumnus of the Year. In November 2010, he was appointed Special Advisor on Arts and Culture to the Mayor of Toronto, who shall go unnamed. Jeff is, to say the very least, one of Canada's smartest and most dynamic cultural leaders. He's one of our best examples of the fact that you can put culture, education, and business in bed together, and the sex isn't always bad. Please join me in welcoming Jeff.
All right. Well, that was very well done. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for that generous introduction. I tend to have trouble with mic height because of my freakish size. There we go. That should work. Wanted to thank the University of Western Ontario for this opportunity, as well as Museum London for hosting me. They've had me quite busy today, so if I seem like I'm stretched to the max, it's because they've worked me every minute. But it's been great. Clearly, there's a lot of energy in London around not only the university but also the arts community. So it's a delight to see that. Before I start, and I've got a fairly long presentation for you, so if you're expecting something that was shortish, I'm going to disappoint you. If you do fall asleep, I did do a presentation a couple weeks ago for Rotarians in Calgary, and if you did fall asleep during the presentation, I won't be offended at all. I do have a soothing voice. I did want to also acknowledge that a lot of the work that I get to do is built on the backs of other people. Or, people will often say leadership is about standing on the shoulders of giants. And in fact, we have one of those giants from the Banff Center in the room with us tonight, David Layton. So David, why don't you stand up, David? David was president of the Banff Center between 1970 and 1982, and he and Peggy were the dynamic duo on campus for those 12 years. And in many ways, the work that I'm doing now is really trying to live up to the good example set by people like the Laytons. So thank you for being here tonight and for hosting me for dinner last night. So we'll launch in. I'll have to try to figure out a way to get back at Joel throughout my presentation as well for his introduction. So my biography, as was stated, is very confusing. I grew up in Winnipeg. I was really part of a lower middle class family. Played sports. Art was a very late sort of addition to my life, and a very wonderful addition. In many ways, art chose me, as I've said to people. And then a whole series of strange universities and professional jobs have led me to this moment standing before you today. What I've done in the last 12 years is really run these 3 institutions. So I'm 39 now, I look like I'm 60. Arts management years are like dog years. They really take it out of you, I will tell you. Royal Conservatory of Music, of course, has the 2nd largest music examination system in the world, examining 110,000 Canadians, or torturing children coast to coast to coast every year. Built the Kerner Center and the TELUS Center for Performance and Learning over the last 10 years. Project 2 is the Ballet School, which is an incredible institution in Toronto offering professional ballet training, another sort of physical plant property. And of course the Banff Center, which is the world's largest arts and creativity incubator. 4,000 artists come through the center every year, developing new works. That's sort of our area of focus, is incubating new artistic practice and new works of art. Pretty special place to be. In addition to those 4,000 artists, we have 2,000 mathematicians on campus every year, and 2,000 business leaders in our leadership development programming, so it's quite an eclectic campus. Before getting started, if I could just by show of hands, how many artists do we have in the room tonight? That's better than usual, which is good to see. I made this point earlier this afternoon. If I were to ask a room of non-artistic types, how many artists, very few people put up their hand. And if you ask the same room full of people, business leaders, community leaders, and so on, how many of you are runners, often many people will put up their hand. And for some reason, we've created a culture where sports and participation, you can be an average runner and identify as a runner, and yet when we ask people to identify as artists, very few people do, because we as an artistic sector have told you, probably when you were a kid, to mouth the words, or that you weren't a very good dancer, or you had the wrong body type, and so on. So on behalf of the various cultural institutions that I run, for any of you that were told any of those things, I apologize. It wasn't about your artistic ability, it was about our incapacity to recognize the beauty of your body and your form. In terms of just some personal style assumptions before we move ahead, one of the things that I like to do within cultural institutions is start with the assumption that we might be completely wrong. There's sort of a bit of a how to put it, sensitivity in the artistic world to question ourselves, and certainly if anyone is to ask us questions, immediately we frame that they don't get the arts, that they're a barbarian or some such thing. And I find it generally just helpful to start with the assumptions that there may be ways that we can be more effective at what we do, that some of our fundamental assumptions about arts and creativity may be incorrect. And certainly not that long ago, there was a period of time on this planet where the smartest people in the world were convinced the world is flat, and it's quite possible that we continue to think such things. Also like to focus on a company called IDEO. I don't know if any of you have heard of this company. This was the design firm that worked with Apple and really helped propel Apple into the company that it is today. This book was written by one of the founders of IDEO, and it talks about innovation and complex problem solving. And the point that Tom Kelly makes in the book is if you're addressing a complex problem, you want to get a whole raft of different perspectives around the table in addressing it. And what we tend to do in universities and arts and cultural institutions and businesses is address complex problems by really bringing a bunch of people who think the exact same way to the table, which is really not all that helpful. So we try to be open-minded and diverse. For anyone who doesn't want to spend the money to buy the book, the first chapter is available for free online, and Tom takes issue with the notion of the devil's advocate. In his first chapter, it's quite beautiful, and he says, why is it when we get a group of people together, there's someone in the room who determines it's their role to be the smartest person there and to snuff out any idea before you've really had a chance to explore it, which I think is a really good point. So I think one of the important things in terms of, again, solving complex problems in addition to making sure you have a diverse series of perspectives around the table is making sure that you're giving yourself the possibility of allowing the green shoots of new ideas and some chance to breathe before you kill them. And finally, before we launch into the formal agenda, I did talk a little bit about Daniel Pink and Carl Dunker this afternoon, and I'll retread that ground because most of you were not there. So this experiment, has anyone done this experiment before? Oh, good. Oh, someone at the back. Don't tell people the answer. So Carl, in the 50s, he was a cognitive psychologist, and he came up with the notion of functional fixity. And the way he would test for this is he would put people in a cubicle and put these three props in front of them: a box of tacks, a candle, and some matches. And your job is to attach the candle to the side of the cubicle, light it so that none of the wax drips onto the base of the cubicle. And it typically takes people a very, very long time to figure this out. Has anyone who didn't know this before figured it out already? Yeah.
Take all the tacks out of the box and use one tack to stick it over the base of the candle and light it, is my guess.
Well done. Well done. That kind of ruined the whole point of the slide. Thank you for solving that so quickly. So yes, indeed, there are four objects to solve the problem on the table. The box itself is part of the solution. So you actually pin the box to the side of the cubicle and put the candle on top. So the notion of functional fixity is that we come to look at certain things in a fixed way, and we can't reimagine them for different contexts and purposes. And I would say an institution is no different than that box. We use an institution like the Banff Centre in a certain way to address certain issues. And as circumstances around us change, we have to be adaptable and be able to sort of reimagine the purpose of our institution to reflect the opportunities faced by our society. Daniel Pink, who's the great motivational psychologist and speaker, recreated this experiment about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And he added financial incentives. So he would say to a room of people like you, the first two people are going to get $100 each. And he found that people do worse with a financial incentive than when there is no financial incentive. And the point that he makes in his book, Driven, which is a great book, is that we are incentivizing the wrong type of behavior. And if we're trying to get people to really be mindful and reflective on complex problems, commodifying behavior and rewarding productivity and speed and efficiency sometimes is not the best sort of way forward. So that's just maybe some tangential side points that you didn't need to hear, but the notion of functional fixity, of the fact that we become so attached to the medium that we lose sight of the fact that we can sort of adapt our various institutions and approaches to address different challenges, is something that we need to address. So I'm going to take you through a 6-part talk tonight. Part 1, some assumptions. I'm an ex-Torontonian. As you know, people from Toronto have to talk about Toronto, so point 2 is about Toronto. I'm an Albertan now, so I think this is safe because we're in Ontario. If I do this in Calgary, I get in serious trouble. Talk about the external environment, some concepts around innovation and disruptive innovation, and then I'll open up the ballet school and what's coming next for the Banff Centre for your critique and consideration. So in terms of assumptions, one of the assumptions that we make, and this ties back to, well, it ties back to 250 years ago, we created this idea simultaneously in the mid-1700s, around 1750, of the aesthetic divide, which is a work of art should be a standalone piece that we then assess. We judge from an aesthetic standpoint. And the notion that art was something that was fundamental, that was part of human expression, was kind of lost in that step. And I would say that over the last 260 years, we've gradually moved art further and further away from people. And we're now at a point where, for most people, art is about consuming. And when you talk about the arts sector, often our advocacy is really the government should give us more money so we can create more art that you should really like and buy. It's not really about active engagement. So one of the perspective differences, I think, in terms of the various institutions I've been running is really trying to focus on art as being a fundamental part of human experience. And if you think of most of our artistic practice, art is a really small step away from just fundamental humanness. Pulse and rhythm and how we interact with those things. All of you, whether you believe it or not, sing all day, you inflect on pitch. And I always run into people who say I can't sing, which is not true. You can all sing. We're all dancers. We all move through space. I know that for a fact because I was here 45 minutes ago and none of you were here, so clearly you're moving. So all of the artistic forms of expression that we have really are just a natural extension of who we are as human beings. So I think part of the job of arts and culture is to shift how we present ourselves away from thinking that art is the purview of a very small, gifted elite and something that's more fundamental to everybody's life. This book, I hope you know Wade Davis, if you haven't heard of him, very famous Canadian. He wrote this book of Peoples of the World. He's National Geographic's Explorer in Residence, super guy. Was on the board of the Banff Centre for many years. His book talks about cultural extinction and how some of these cultural practices, which have been very innate in other cultures, are disappearing very quickly. So this is important in a couple of levels. One, awakening all of our own creative potential, but also making sure that as we talk about cultural preservation, we're not losing cultural practice as much as we are around the world. On to the Toronto slides, bear with me. I raised the notion about 10 years ago of cultural entrepreneurship. And I have this sort of habit of raising things that make me very unpopular with people. Eventually they come around, I find, which is why the Globe and Mail wrote that favorable article. And when Diane was saying, she cut out the article, I was pretty sure she was going to say, and then I put it into the bottom of the birdcage, but I'm delighted to hear it got onto a reading pile. Why is this important? Ultimately, further to my just previous point, artistic practice is important in and of itself. So if you as an artist want to create whatever, I believe in that. And there's something beautiful about any human being getting up in front of another group of people, or anyone, and saying, I wrote this poem, I created this work, I'm going to sing you this song, I'm going to dance for you. Like, there's something just fundamentally beautiful about that. Where money becomes important is if you want to get paid to do that. So when I talk about cultural enterprise, what I'm talking about is all of my artist friends who don't get paid well enough. And you probably know this stat. Dancers in Canada, in 2011, the average professional dancer earned $18,000 a year as a dancer. 18. And dancers have careers that are about, well, it depends, 5 to 10 years, maybe sometimes 15. Karen Kane's an exception. So compensation is important. If you want to earn a living as an artist, you have to be mindful of some different models and approaches to how that is borne out. This, when I was the mayor's arts advisor, and I'd be happy to field questions later over some drinks on that, though I will say, and I made this point earlier, when the mayor was elected, he had voted against every single arts proposal for 8 consecutive years as a councillor. Since becoming mayor, his council unanimously passed a culture plan, which we authored, and last, I guess it was a month ago, put in the largest funding increase that any municipal arts council has ever received. So you have a Rob Ford as mayor putting forward a $4 million increase to the Toronto Arts Council this year on April 3rd, which is pretty fantastic. So people can be brought around. I'm not defending his everything else. but he certainly made me some promises and lived up to them, I will have to say that. Going backwards in time to 1991. So Toronto, I'm just here from Montreal, and Montrealers have looked with envy to some degree on what's happened in Toronto in the past 20 years. And so the question is, how did it happen? How did Toronto's arts and culture scene grow so much over the 20-year period? So what we have here, the purple line, is the average growth of the sector. So if you took all 1,200 arts organizations in Toronto that receive municipal arts funding and add their budgets together, and then look at growth trajectory, the purple line is the growth of that total group as a budget whole. The green line is combined federal and provincial funding. The red line would be inflation, assuming it was flat, which of course it isn't, but just bear with me on that. The orange line is municipal funding, which you see was trailing inflation for a good many years. Between the green and the purple line, a line that's not there, so if you're looking for it, there isn't a line there, there should be, would be the earned revenue growth line. So that's ticket sales, retail, and so on. The blue line at the top are private donations to arts and culture. So the only revenue class that has exceeded the average growth of the sector is private sector donations. So when we talk about the importance of the private sector, you can see up in the early 90s, we didn't really have that level of private philanthropy, and then it just took off over the last 15 years. I should also tell you, this does not include the capital projects. So there's about $2 billion of private investment on top of what you see reflected here. This is just the annual operating budget. So I'd like to share this chart particularly with young arts leaders just to remind them or let them know that they are going to have to be mindful of the private sector to some degree as they move forward. Oh, I should also say, so in 2009, which is the last year of this chart, if you took the budgets of those 1,200 arts organizations and added them all together, the total is about $305 million, which in Canada is a lot of money. That very same year, the Metropolitan Opera in New York had a $310 million operating budget. So the entire arts sector of Toronto added together is smaller than one of the big New York arts organizations. And that's really important when we talk about global competitiveness, because that's the kind of field that we're playing on. So we need to have to be nimble, entrepreneurial, and assertive. On the external environment, I'm going to talk a little bit about change and then content partnership opportunities for arts and culture. So we're going through a period of unprecedented change. However, as human beings, we go through these periods on a fairly consistent basis, which would call into question the notion of it being unprecedented. And in fact, if you look over the 20th century, there was a period where electricity was going to destroy arts and culture, and then the radio was going to destroy arts and culture, and then TV was going to destroy arts and culture, and now the internet is going to destroy arts and culture. And in fact, after the fact, we discover that each of those different human inventions has actually resulted in much more consumption and creation of arts and culture. So while we are struggling to adapt to a social media, or the digital media revolution as it's sometimes called, odds are once we adapt to it, it will actually be quite an effective tool for us in terms of getting cultural engagement up and getting our messaging out there. In terms of what's happened in the content business in Canada, this is a look at the ICT, or Information Communication Technology sector, in 2006. So 2006, which wasn't that long ago, you had 5 big ICT companies. Video content was a totally separate business, so the ICT was just infrastructure. And then we largely watched content on one screen. So if you fast forward to 2011, you see that almost all of the ICT companies have now bought different content providers, and we're now consuming content on a variety of different screens. What's interesting when you look at the sort of content side of this, you'll see it's almost all sports-oriented, or heavily sports-oriented. So there is a real opportunity for Canadian arts and culture to imagine its place on these various different platforms. And I used to say, TELUS doesn't have anything in that box, so we should be talking to them probably directly. But really significant opportunities, and what you find with most of the broadcasters is they are long on video channels and short on substantive content. And arts and culture, our whole sector, is about content, so there's a really significant opportunity for us there. In terms of what it might mean, so I think first and foremost what we're seeing is people want to engage. So if one were to look in the last, 20 years at the notion of reality television, which is not something you normally hear an arts leader talk about. Huge popularity, particularly 3 or 4 years ago, around the Idol shows, the So You Think You Can Dances, that kind of thing, which I think was a manifestation of the fact that we don't have arts education in the public schools. People want to consume some content, and so watching people try to learn was something that was interesting. So I think there was a clear indication that people wanted to engage. What we were not seeing was any conversion of that sort of interest into engagement with not-for-profit arts organizations. A number of new channels for delivery, tons of opportunities for us to get content in front of people, very difficult to make money on those various different platforms. Sadly, our public has no or limited arts education. In a period where most of our mayors, many of our mayors, have become enchanted with the notion of creative cities, which we can thank Richard Florida for, we have built out consumption opportunities, but we've actually underfunded arts education. So in the period of growth in the last 10 years in Ontario, for example, where we had a very arts-friendly premier, we built out a lot of new cultural infrastructure, but we actually lost about half of our music teachers in the public school system. So we're building out opportunities to attract and retain talent, but in terms of developing our own innate talent as Canadians, we're missing the boat on that. Sadly, we have no money, so the arts sector is a bit challenged in terms of its capacity to experiment, and sometimes we use that as an excuse not to, which is a bit of a mistake. And really interesting opportunities to draw young audiences. We don't know how to do that, so we end up doing things like creating young patrons councils, which tend not to work particularly well. And we have rights issues that are challenging. On the Young Patrons Council, do you have these in London? Young Patrons Councils for organizations, yeah? So maybe because very few people are nodding, I'll tell you what that is. In Toronto, there was this movement about 10 years ago, recognition that if you looked around the donor pool, most of the donors to arts and culture were quite old. And so the idea was to create young patrons councils that would engage younger people in arts and creativity. And really the, subtext attached to each of those, or the sub-goal, was to get a bunch of upwardly mobile young people attached to an institution and then wait for them to get old and rich. And I think that's actually true in how it's folded out. So I was at a meeting with a bunch of these people at one point in Toronto, and they were talking, and they said, well, you have to realize if we're going to get our friends to come, it has to be cool Like, there can't be too much art stuff. Like, we really want a DJ and a vodka bar and all these things, and I like all those things, don't get me wrong, but it seemed very peculiar that we were drawing young people to our institutions to serve on these councils, but not actually asking for their advice in terms of how we revise the content, how we reimagine the institution, and so on. It literally was just party planning around various events, and again, waiting for them to get older and more moneyed, which is inadequate in terms of engagement with a younger audience. So innovation, I'm going to talk a bit about that. I mentioned earlier today, I was asked recently to speak at the opening of an office in Calgary, and typically it's very unusual in Calgary for an arts person to do a keynote at an office opening. And I asked people why, and they said, well, our mandate for our corporation has innovation in every sentence, and we're not really sure what that means. So what you hear in the business world today, and certainly in politics, is a lot of talk around risk-taking and innovation and so on. So I decided to do a little bit of research, and I was talking to some friends, and because the Banff Centre is an odd institution that has not only an arts development section, but a business school, we looked at sort of the core underpinnings of business education. So back in '79, Michael Porter at Harvard published this notion of the 5 forces model. People here been to business school? Does that look familiar to you? So when I did my MBA in '98, '99, this was the cornerstone of strategy at Laurier. That was 20 years old research at that stage. And what this provides is a really clear static snapshot of how competitive you are, but it doesn't actually project into the future. It's not really very dynamic. We moved in business school training from that model into Clay Christensen's work. I hope you're familiar with Clay. Clay is also a Harvard prof who created the notion of disruptive innovation. And this is the sort of slide that he speaks to. I'm stealing his intellectual property to some degree here. But what he talks about is the blue line in his mind is an incumbent line. So for a successful organization, you're on the blue line. And because you're well trained as a general manager, you gradually implement a series of sustaining innovations to make your product, your service better for your existing client. Meanwhile, a new entrant emerges that offers a product that's different, differentiated, somewhat often cheaper, it's, sort of strange fit. And you, as a general manager on the blue line, look down at that product and say, wow, our customers don't want this, our audience doesn't want this, and so on. And over time, that green product gets better and better and better until it hits the dotted line, and that's the utility line as he describes it. Everyone bails on the incumbent and goes to the new entrant. And he uses this slide to talk about a whole pile of different sectors and how change comes. And he was kind of obsessed, and when I heard him speak, he was talking about Nortel as an example, where if you remember Nortel in Canada, it was like 1 year, it was the CEO of the year, the genius company, and the next year it was gone. And how does that happen in sectors? So interesting, so that was a more robust or more three-dimensional dynamic look at business strategy and how businesses compete or not. I'm going to come back to that slide later. So I looked at those two things. I was talking to this consulting practice that was opening the office, and we talked about what is innovation, and they didn't have a good definition. So I looked online and I found a very long-winded McKinsey definition, and then I found the really useful Wikipedia definition that looks like this. So that kind of nails it, really, doesn't it? So we weren't really satisfied with that, and we decided we wanted to try to take an approach with our business programming and our arts programming at the Banff Centre to define this. So I worked this through with a few of my colleagues, and we came up with something very, I think, practical, very accessible, very non-sophisticated, which is this: practical application of creativity, which we kind of like. The words are all accessible, it's not too esoteric. What we like about it is it kind of opens up for us some conversations around practical. For what end, what's the purpose, what's the end game? Sometimes practical is profit maximization for shareholders, but I would say most businesses are actually not really in that business. They're in the business of getting their staff excited about making a difference in the world. That sounds, I know, really artsy-fartsy, but anyhow, I do believe that that's true. Certainly in the arts, that's what we're all about. It's, practical application, practical approaches to what we're trying to do and how we present it. So really interesting opportunities to engage business leaders, arts leaders, not-for-profits in the conversation about what we're trying to achieve, what kind of world we're trying to build. On the application side, we haven't really studied this very effectively, I don't think. I mentioned earlier today, you've got emerging practices like Google, which you probably know this, 1 day a week their staff gets off to work on whatever type of project they would like, which is very unusual in terms of productivity measures when we're like, we want people at work full on all day, every day. There's a real opportunity for us to say, okay, within organizations, within the arts organizations, not-for-profits or business approaches, what kind of space are we creating for people to be imaginative? And if they're working full on, we know that they're actually not. And I raised the story earlier today of, there's a study Stanford has just put out on creativity, where they took creative types, designers, architects, and so on, in their natural habitat, which is cities, and tested them on standard creativity test scores. And then they took them out into nature and gave them 4 days without iPhones, without technology, and so on. And they scored 50% higher after the natural experiences compared to being overstimulated in cities. So I think we do need to think very dynamically about the approaches and structure we're taking, or how we're creating the conditions for creativity to flourish. On the creativity side, as I mentioned earlier, having a bunch of people around the table who all think the same is not necessarily the best way, one, to have a conversation, and two, to solve complex problems. So what we're doing at the BAM Center, the approach we're trying to take, is really to be really open-minded about the kinds of perspectives we want to bring to bear on various different complex problems again. And I think there it's really important that arts and culture accepts the fact that there are creative people in all disciplines and that we're very open-minded, because much as we criticize oil and gas companies for being just all engineers or CFOs, likewise a group of dancers all together trying to fix something creates a very interesting series of opportunities. Very short meetings though, dancers do not like to sit down for long, I discovered at the ballet school. So just to summarize, I think when we talk about innovation in our society, the big questions are why to what end, what kind of focus are we taking in terms of creating the conditions for creativity and imagination to flourish, and then what are our filters, what kind of perspectives do we want to build? And I just don't think we're intentional enough about building those cross-sectoral approaches to problem solving and so on. So just leading off that topic, I want to talk a little bit about disruptive innovation with respect to arts and culture. So we have this emerging model from the Metropolitan Opera. Just by show of hands, how many people have seen the Met in a cinema near you? Some people, that's good. So that was a very disruptive thing that Peter Gelb did. Peter would tell you, the general director of the Met, that what he did really was just extending the Texaco broadcast, which for many years the Met would do in terms of radio, but now into cinemas. The really disruptive play with the Metropolitan Opera, and what Peter does obviously is a lot of money to invest in quality program, is disseminate the content through cinemas, but also to archive all that content. And he's now created a thing called the Met Player, which will allow any of you to download these operas into your home. So in addition to going to the cinema, you now have access to 300 Met-level operas, which you in high definition format can download into any person's home or on any device. That is very disruptive. For a regional opera company, that is terrifying that that's possible. For an arts audience, you have access to some of the best content in the world. And what Peter has done at the Met is taken the gold standard player in the opera world on the world stage and also made it the most nimble, dynamic, young-oriented organization at the same time, which is pretty cool. I'm adjusting this mic too much. As well, in terms of smaller examples, well, maybe not so smaller. Arcade Fire fans in the room? Anyone? Like, yes? Hey, that's good. So how many of you have done the Wilderness Downtown video? Not as many. If you haven't done that, you should check it out. So Arcade Fire got the Grammy nomination, and they would tell you they credit this music video with the Grammy nod. This video, you go on the website and you enter the street address of the house where you grew up, and they use Google Earth technology, and the music video is shot on the street where your childhood home would be. So very, very cool. The bottom here is me dancing to a Danish group. They launched their video, and basically you could superimpose your face and post it on Facebook. And yeah, later tonight I'll show you my moves. I did run a ballet school for 5 years, for Pete's sake. Top right-hand corner is a music video called Her Morning Elegance by Oren Levy. This was one of the first sort of viral videos. Oren was an obscure musician, Israeli musician living in Los Angeles, created this video, quickly had 25 million hits. He was also up for a Grammy all of a sudden out of nowhere. And in the bottom right, Farmville. Any Farmville players? Bless you for that. So Farmville social media game, of course, typically, I think it may be on the waning side now, but you'll get regular emails from your friends, as you know, to plant digital carrots in their garden and such things. Farmville monetized $300 million in digital carrots last year. So this is a game that's selling something that doesn't exist using a digital media app. So what's interesting there, why I raise it, is potential opportunity for arts and culture to look at how we adapt to that space, and a very scalable kind of investment required as well, and arguably some new things emerging. The Oren Levy piece, Oren partnered with a friend of his who's a photographer, and it's 1,600 digital stills to create the music video, which were also sold online as part of this. A really interesting and dynamic way of thinking about bringing different artistic practice and e-commerce together. This is a slide that will get me in trouble, and it's back for a second time. So it's a test now. What did I say about it the first time? No, I won't do that to you. So after experiencing Clay Christensen as part of a YPO retreat, I started thinking, why doesn't this happen in arts and culture? So if you look at most industries, you can see the churn and the renewal and so on. And arguably, if you were to look at arts and culture institutions in Toronto and Calgary, anywhere else now, and compare them to 15 years ago, it's more or less the same organizations. There are a few new entrants, but very few. And in fact, the big organizations are still the big organizations, and very few small organizations have become big organizations over the last 15 years. So I think the skew factor here is that the people on the blue line, and bear in mind, every institution I've run has been on the blue line, so in terms of being a new entrant, I don't have any experience with that, get a disproportionate amount of government funding and private sector funding. So if you run a large organization, as I have, you get access to funding, which is really more about how long you've existed than about excellence. So this is a massive challenge for arts and culture in the country. Something that we can't really necessarily address because frankly, if we pulled money out of the large institutions, they would cease to exist. But I think what it's forcing, which is quite distinctive for us, is a responsibility on the larger institutions to collaborate with the new entrants. So what I should be doing at the Banff Center, which we do, is providing young emerging artists with opportunities to experiment using our platform. And we did the same at the Ballet School and the Conservatory, and I'll tell you a bit more about that going forward. That is a really disruptive point in that most organizations or many arts leaders in the country would tell you the big organizations get funding because they're excellent and the others don't because they're not excellent, which I don't think is true actually. I think it's more about size, scale, and when you were founded, which is not necessarily the best way to support arts and culture investment. So, how have I applied these things? This is where if I were really tired, I could just say, as a hypocrite, I don't apply any of them. Thanks for your time. I have tried to apply these things as much as possible. I'll tell you just a quick story about the Royal Conservatory of Music before I launch into the Ballet School and the Banff Center. I became dean at the conservatory when I was 27 and wasn't ready for that particularly. Being very tall and having gray hair is a big advantage, so I highly recommend for any of the arts leaders or young arts leaders in the room, go gray early. It's worth a try. So the conservatory was about to launch into this really amazing capital campaign. Very stressful capital campaign as well. And we hired Ketchum, which is a very well-known fundraising consulting firm, to take a look at our students to determine how much money we could raise. So we looked at our students and we discovered that our students on average were in the top 3% of income and wealth in Canada, which when you are about to launch a $100 and some million capital campaign is good news. The bad news was we were in Toronto. We were in this city which had become so dynamic, so ethnically diverse. And when we started to dig deeper into the data, we found that we were not reflecting Toronto at all in terms of cultural diversity, in terms of programmatic change, and so on. So we launched back in 2003 the World Music Center, which I will admit we didn't launch very well in the first year. We made some terrible hiring mistakes and really learned how to do profound community consultation. But what drove us in that direction, honestly, was recognizing that we had so many incredible artists from all over the world within Toronto that just had no place to teach. And many of them should be teaching. Like we ended up discovering we had 4 senior faculty from the Shanghai Conservatory, pipa, guzheng, a bunch of the sort of key Chinese instruments, who again, there was no place for them in Canada. They got in on points because they were esteemed faculty, and then of course there was no place for them to teach. So really huge upside opportunities there. We also did something that was also very popular at the conservatory. We launched a turntable techniques class for aspiring DJs in 2004. For purists in the classical music world, that was the worst thing ever, and I'm still a villain for such things. But we ended up hiring the guy who was DJ, still is DJ for Chaos, and Nelly Furtado, who also had a master's degree in education and built a curriculum that was actually better than any other curriculum we were offering at the conservatory. So it wasn't just notionally saying, well, let's do a turntable class because it's cool. It was really pedagogically sound in terms of the delivery. So interesting models. The other sort of side points would be, we did big aspirational things, but the division I ran had lost money for 118 years. It had lost money since 1886, and we turned it into a profit center without government funding, which was fun. And when I left, 6,000 students as well. So I think you can marry together big conceptual thinking with financial and enrollment growth. At the ballet school, when I started back in 2006, my very first board meeting, at this point I was 33, so I was old at this point. My first board meeting was all about bankruptcy and insolvency, which I have to say, when you started a new organization and those are the two buzzwords of the night, very, very fun. We just built this great new building. We had lost $2 million a year before I came, and we're almost out of cash. So what we did was a couple of things there. First, I started meeting with all the staff, which is something that I do. We had 230 staff at the ballet school, and asking for their advice in terms of how we fix it. I also asked them about the mission statement. The mission statement at that point, and this is very standard for not-for-profits, was about 6 sentences long and was written for the federal government. So of the 230 staff, none of them knew what the mission statement was. Not a single person, which was good and bad. It was good in that I could do whatever I wanted because no one cared. No one was that affixed to it. It's bad in that the mission statement should be something that's a rallying cry for an institution. So we shortened it a little to Moving the World. We made sure to always have the logo presented with that so people didn't think we were a moving company, which worked. But we really were thinking much bigger about what the ballet school's role could be in society and so on. And we focused on 4 key elements going forward. One is legacy, as you probably picked up earlier tonight. For me, legacy and history within institutions is really important. And ultimately, we are building off of what builders before us did. So it's not that you stay fixed forever, but just the inspiration for the past, for me at the BAM Center, is presidents like David Layton, who were builders. And so my responsibility is to build on that legacy. We had some other ideas in terms of digital media, cultural entrepreneurship, and the very not so sexy acronym BCPI, Building Cultural Participatory Infrastructure. I was trying to come up with a sexy way to describe that and obviously failed miserably at that. I didn't have a SASA, or I think Sasha would be better if you put the H before the A. I would think about that very seriously. So objective 1, building on the legacy. So the ballet school, talent is the sole entry criterion. So everyone's tuition is geared to their income. So if you have no income and you have a talented child, they're in the ballet school for free. That's been the long-running founding principle that we were adhering to. Celia Franca, who I didn't tell the story tonight. Celia Franca, who founded the ballet school and the ballet company in 1951 and 1959. When she came to Canada as a dancer, at first worked at Eaton's as a sales clerk and paid dancers out of her sales clerk strategy to find their salary to find the National Ballet of Canada. So again, in terms of legacy, incredible stuff in terms of entrepreneurial. For us, really, really important that students are fully funded. So the big story of that year was Sipe, who's the middle of the photo here, who was one of 9 kids from South Africa. By fluke, a Canadian music teacher was volunteering in his village and found this super talented young kid, videotaped him, and a couple months later he was at the ballet school on a full scholarship, which was a pretty remarkable story. He was in the Nutcracker, I think, actually that December. So he went from like abject poverty in South Africa to the stages of the National Ballet of Canada, which is a pretty incredible story.